was 6:38 a.m. on the morning of August 6, 1890. An American inventor and pioneer of electricity, Thomas Edison, was about to change the world. Thomas Edison and his team of scientists, dentists, and doctors would be responsible for the deaths of 4,443 individuals with the electric chair, but William Kemmler would be the first and possibly most prominent. The man himself was not prominent, but the circumstances around his death were. You see, he was just a simple guy who was living his life, murdered somebody, and then the courts decided that he deserved to die. Thomas Edison himself was not a fan of capital punishment. He didn't like execution at all. But he figured that in the meantime, before we can get it eliminated from the court system entirely, we should try to do it as quickly and painlessly as possible. This led to the invention of the electric chair, patented by his company, and mainly invented by a dentist that worked for him. It began at 6:38 in the morning after Kemmler ate his last meal and had his head and neck shaved. He stated his last words saying, quote, "Take it easy and do it properly. I'm in no rush." After an electric current coursed through the body of William Kemmler for 17 seconds, he lay still. One of the inventors of the chair, a dentist named Dr. Alfred Southwick, stood up and proudly proclaimed, quote, There is the culmination of 10 years' work and study. We live in a higher civilization from this day." With morbidly ironic timing, William Kemmler's unconscious body began moaning in agony, still very much alive. Everyone in the room yelled and screamed at the executioner to turn the contraption back on, and he did so, flipping the switch, but first doubling the current, sending upwards of 1,000, if not 2,000 volts into the body of William Kemmler. The stench of burning flesh filled the room, and Kemmler's blood vessels began to burst. Blood was seeping from his eyes and from his skin. After 2 minutes of this, some witnesses began to faint, whereas others ran for the exits and were sick. It took 8 minutes from the time that the lever was initially pulled to the moment of William Kemmler's death. Another American inventor, one of the founding fathers of electricity, George Westinghouse, stated, "It was a brutal affair. They could have done better with an axe." I tell this story of the Edison Company's invention and William Kemmler's death to provide a snapshot into the history of execution in America. This is just 130 years ago, and we have the electric chair, which would then be used to execute 4,432 more people after this brutal incident. We all would like to think that we are very far removed from this level of execution, from hanging, or poison gas, or the firing squad, or the electric chair, which all seem brutal and inhumane. All of these other execution methods seem terrible and brutal, and it makes sense why they were outlawed and replaced by something that appears much more humane, a simple injection of a needle. But even lethal injection is not humane yet. That's not the direction I'm taking this video in just yet. Recently, the matter of capital punishment has become extremely politicized, where it seems that one side of things has one view on the matter, whereas another side of things has another view on the matter, and they're polar opposite sides on polar opposite beliefs, and they're just biting at each other and kicking and screaming and being like, "Stop believing that, I hate everything you stand for," and that accomplishes nothing. But this issue is not really a political issue. It shouldn't matter what side of politics you are on, because there's pretty much a clear-cut answer as to whether or not we should keep executing people. This system is a statistician's nightmare where there's numbers and evidence that supports one thing, yet people insist on arguing against that. The thesis of this video is simple. We cannot keep executing people in the United States of America because our current system is far too expensive, fundamentally classist and racist, and sometimes, and far too often, we get the wrong guy. Capital punishment is in no way humane, which you may think doesn't matter because these are serial killers and psychopaths that we're executing. But what happens when it's the wrong person that we're executing? 1,603 Americans have been executed since 1973, according to the Death Penalty Information Center. In that same period of time, exactly 200 people have been exonerated from death row, their sentences reversed, fully releasing them from prison. This is not a good thing. You see, it sounds wonderful. It sounds like 200 innocent lives have been saved, right? 200 people who didn't commit the crime can go back and live the life that was almost taken from them. That is true, but the darker truth is much more eerie and haunting. 1 out of 8 prisoners who were sentenced to death did not commit the crime that put them on death row. It is extremely plausible that 1 out of 8 executed prisoners were also innocent because the previous statistic only accounts for the mistakes that were both caught and overturned before it was too late. We know not the true number of innocent people who suffered from the legal equivalence of a viper's bite, slowly being asphyxiated by toxins that paralyzed them, preventing them from voicing their agony and their innocence. We know not the true number of legal blunders that have been made, unforced and unpunished errors that led to the death of a human being. What we do know is that cracking down on murderers and executing them in droves will not solve any problems, but instead cause far more. I'm going to simply state the issues with lethal injection, and then we can continue, because it is imperative that everyone know that the execution method that is the current standard throughout the United States of America that seems to be the most humane is not, in fact, what it seems to be. You see, lethal injection, whether done by like a witch's brew of 3 drugs or just 1 drug and then you're done, is designed in such a way so that the drugs will paralyze the victim's motor functions and then kill them. Now, we don't need to get into how no doctors were in charge of this system in choosing the drugs, and how the drugs that were chosen are banned in Europe, thus making it far more expensive than it should be because we can no longer buy the drugs to kill people anymore. If you want to go down the rabbit hole and finding out about how this was made, then go for it, okay? You can go find out why this is the current standard. What we do know is that lethal injection is the most botched execution method that we currently have, because there are so many ways to do it wrong, and medical professionals are not allowed to help in any way. You see, when you take the Hippocratic Oath, you promise to do no harm, and thus no doctors are legally and morally able to assist in an execution. This means we have unqualified people sticking needles in places where they shouldn't go, and resulting in toxic liquids being injected into straight up muscle or skin, leading to ghastly chemical burns. I'll let you look up images if you would like. In the year of 2022 alone, 7 out of 19 lethal injections were botched, resulting in death row inmates being stabbed with needles for anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours straight, while strapped down, unable to move at all. Lethal injection is more for the witnesses than the prisoners themselves, because what ends up happening is the victim is paralyzed, unable to move, and it appears that they're just sitting there and they go to sleep. What's happening on the inside, however, is far worse than it appears. According to a study done by NPR, 84% of lethal injection victims suffered a buildup of liquid in the lungs known as a pulmonary edema. This edema causes a sensation eerily reminiscent to the horrors of waterboarding, slowly drowning the victim in their own fluids until they die. One might argue that they deserve this kind of torture, that capital punishment should be employed no matter how painful, because at a certain point, one loses their humanity when committing a deranged crime, and when they forfeit their humanity, they forfeit their life. For instance, you could take the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, somebody who raped, murdered, and cannibalized 17 people. Dahmer intended to control the minds of his victims, performing experiments such as drilling holes in their skull while they're still living and pouring acid or boiling water into it. There is no world in which a man like that ought to live, especially with the government or taxpayer footing the cost of his life, right? Since this man has committed unspeakable acts and murdered people in horrible ways, shouldn't he deserve a death, no matter how painful? This argument is compelling, and it partially comes down to personal beliefs. You can truly believe that somebody who does horrible things deserves horrible things done back to them. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth kind of thing, right? Even though these execution methods are scientifically shown to be extremely painful and just meant to give onlookers a clear conscience, it doesn't matter, because the people that commit the crimes deserve the time. But the way I personally look at it is that even if a human commits heinous and unspeakable crimes against their fellow man, having all of your freedom taken away is punishment enough. In order to consider the golden rule, right, you did this to somebody, so you deserve a similar death yourself, we can't extend that only between the murderer and the victim. It has to be extended between us and the murderer as well. If one tortures a man to death because he did the same thing to others, the moral high ground that is established is shaky, to say the least. One cannot claim moral superiority when they employ similar methods of execution to that of their condemned prisoner. "They did it first" is the mantra of a third grader who is in trouble for hitting their friend on the schoolyard playground. And wouldn't one mistake warrant the destruction of the whole system? If one innocent man were to be tortured to death, isn't that the crime that already warrants death in the current system? Would the maker of that mistake, whether a bad lawyer or a governmental officer or an executioner, be put to death for their stake in murdering an innocent man? In the current system, nothing happens. You can make as many mistakes as you want and you'll just get voted into the same position time after time again. The main issue in any case is the threat of an innocent person dying, which is the exact issue that execution aims to solve, preventing people from murdering innocent people. Many people assume that being tough on crime and handing out executions like candy on Halloween is what is necessary to deter crime, right? If the punishment for stealing a horse is death, as it was in colonial times, no one's gonna steal a horse because they don't want to die, right? You may not want to steal horses anymore, but the amount of crime would not drop. You see, there's no evidence that states with the death penalty have lower crime rates than in states without them. In fact, the murder rates in states with the death penalty are higher than in states without it. Now, this is correlation and not causation, right? It's not like, oh, because of the death penalty, more people are murdering more people. But no, all that I'm saying is that there's no evidence to point to the fact that executions deter crime, and there's evidence that states that executions do not deter crime. So we've covered how sometimes we get the wrong person, and also that I don't personally think that it makes moral sense. You can still believe that it makes moral sense, but we're going to get into something that's more concrete and statistical, the finances of execution. You see, one of the major arguments surrounding capital punishment is that it is cheaper than life in prison. You see, rather than just having somebody sit in prison for the rest of their lives and rotting away, because that's the alternative to execution. It's either execution or life without parole, right? If someone's in prison for the rest of their life, then that's costing the taxpayer money, but as soon as they're executed, we no longer have to worry about them, no longer have to pay any more money. And while I would love to concede that point, because I'm all for the government saving money, that's not the case. A study done in California in 2011, reported on by the Los Angeles Times, states that California spent $5 billion on death penalty trials and executions since 1977. Those $5 billion resulted in the executions of just 13 human beings. That's right, the state of California was spending more than $370 million per execution. But the issue is that that $5 billion number is not just a blanket cost. It's not just the, oh, this is how much it costs, but how much would it have cost if we put them on prison for the rest of their life? No, that's the calculation of how much more California spent on death penalty trials and executions than they would have had they merely sent someone to prison in a room for the rest of their lives. Well, now you may be wondering, where's that $5 billion going? What costs so much money? Let me break it down for you. Now, death penalty law and trials is so really confusing. I read several books on it, and it still doesn't make perfect sense. I'm going to break it down in like a 2-minute summary, okay? There are 3 parts that we're going to cover on a death penalty trial, right? So 3 major parts are, first, you have finding out if they're guilty, okay? Once we get through that whole trial, you know, we've seen courtroom TV. It's like, well, guilty or not guilty. They've murdered 5 people, let's say. They're found guilty. So now we've established this person's guilty, right? The innocents are proven guilty. Well, they've been proven guilty. The lawyers now, their entire task shifts. They're no longer trying to say, this guy didn't do it. They're trying to say, okay, now that he did do it, we are trying to save his life. He doesn't deserve the death penalty. So they bring forth evidence called mitigating evidence, which is basically like, oh, he's a great guy. He volunteers at the orphanage. He just, made a mistake and murdered 5 people on a whim. So now we move on to the appeals, okay? And then there's 3 main types of appeals. We're going to break them down quickly. We've got direct appeal. This is immediately after they've discovered that this person's guilty and that now they deserve death. We're doing direct appeal, which is where they basically examine the entire trial and they're like, hey, you did this wrong. This deserves a mistrial, okay? They cannot bring up any more evidence. Even if they find, let's say, fingerprints that prove that this guy wasn't here, it was somebody else's fingerprints on the murder weapon, they can't bring that up unless they already brought it up previously. Defense teams can only look at court transcripts for this. They can't bring in any other evidence. They look at the court transcripts and like, hey, there wasn't enough evidence to be beyond a reasonable doubt. There was juror malpractice. That's not the word for it, but what's the word? Jury misconduct that impeded the verdict of the trial. judge misconduct. If there is new evidence that's discovered, they can appeal for a new trial, but it's almost always just immediately rejected because the court that checks the appeals is the same court that just found them as guilty. Now it's post-conviction review. This is in the state court where they are petitioning for a new trial because of injustices that aren't on the record, right? Such as juror misconduct, legal malpractice where the lawyer was incompetent, right? Like there are cases of lawyers who were sleeping on the job or sleeping with the prosecution's wife. And so it's like, yeah, they're probably not fit for this trial. And so you can appeal for a new trial. But this goes directly to the state court who already just sentenced you to death. And they just want to be done with this as quickly as possible because it's one less stack of papers on their desk. So they're probably going to reject your appeal. Other instances of prosecutorial misconduct that can be examined here are like if they bribed people into giving testimony, or intentionally concealed evidence, or just lied about evidence. Finally, we get to habeas corpus, or habeas corpus, which is Latin for let us have the body, which is cool. But in all reality, it's not very cool. And so basically what they're doing is they're bringing a new lawyer into the mix to argue that this lawyer could have done it better, right? That the other lawyer didn't do it right, or they didn't present the right evidence, they didn't do stuff right. And they appeal to a federal judge rather than a district or a state judge. So it's like, new lawyers like, these are all of the places where the old lawyer went wrong throughout the entire trial. This is how I could have done better. And this, again, you can't bring forward any new evidence. This is all previous evidence and court transcripts, right? You can't be like, oh, but wait, there's fingerprints that are definitely not them. The fingerprints don't match. Doesn't matter. Or, oh, they have an alibi. We have them on video camera here. Doesn't matter, right? You can't bring that forward unless it was already brought forward in the trial. And keep in mind that the prisoner's in death row for this whole time, and given that this is the government, it takes so long between all these appeals and stuff. And you know, you got to make sure you file all your extensions right and everything, and it takes years, right? The average prisoner sits on death row for more than 15 years, and some up to 30 or 40 years, all in death row, which costs more than the general prison population. And so all of that costs money, right? It all costs money. We're paying for lawyers, we're paying for judges, we're paying for juror fees, we are paying for expert witnesses. We have to pay for their time so that we can have the guy who does fingerprints be like, well, actually, fingerprints are a terrible way of getting evidence. And it's just stuff like that, right? Because sometimes you can't afford a lawyer, right? And so if you can't afford one, it is constitutionally mandated that one is appointed to you. And so the state has to pay for that too. And so all of it costs money and it all sucks. And so people are like, what if we reduce the length of the trial? I don't know if my mic picked that up. What if we reduce the length of the trial, right? And that's a terrible idea because we already convict the wrong people 13% of the time, right? And after we convict them, there's all these appeals that are trying to get them freed. And without those appeals, we don't free those 13% of people, right? Let me get you some examples of times where someone didn't deserve to die and they did, right? And some injustice on death row because we can't shorten the trials because the trials are super long and they still don't do a good job. Let's take the cases of Michael Swango, the doctor, and Johnny Joe Martinez. Okay, so Dr. Michael Swango, he poisoned upwards of 60 of his patients, got convicted of 5 murders because those are the ones he admitted to. He probably could have killed up to 60 people, at least, okay? Because that's how many he might have poisoned. Swango was a doctor, he was rich, he could afford a good lawyer, and so that lawyer managed to get a plea deal for him. Meanwhile, we have Johnny Joe Martinez, a 19-year-old kid who drunkenly stabbed a man at a gas station, and upon doing so immediately called the police while weeping, and he admitted to everything. And he was executed as quickly as the system would allow him to be. This isn't due to the severity of their crimes, right? It's due to their financial statuses. Swango was a doctor and could afford a good lawyer. Martinez was 19 and couldn't, okay? And what happened was, I mean, you're supposed to get a competent lawyer, but the bar for competency, pardon the pun here, the bar for competency is absurdly low, right? It's absurdly low. Both of these guys confessed to their murders, right? One of them killed 1 person, one of them killed 5. You would think that the guy who confessed to more murders and who was consistently murdering people would get death and the other guy would get life in prison. It's just like there's these systemic issues. Martinez, as soon as he got to the station, he confessed to the first interrogator rather than be like, no, let me talk to my lawyer. Like, this guy was so remorseful for what he did. But let's break down why he died. So Martinez's lawyer did nothing, right? He couldn't afford a lawyer. The state appoints him one. The state appointed lawyer did not see Martinez, did not answer his calls, did not respond to his letters. This is made abundantly clear by, like, Martinez was sending him so many letters, man. I'm going to read an excerpt of one from February 28th, 1998, okay? Quote, I wrote you a letter on the 9th of this month and I still have not heard from you. Sir, I need to hear from you since you have not come up here and spoken to me. Sir, I have written you numerous times and I have not heard from you. Sir, this is my life we are dealing with here. Martinez would then go on to offer legal advice to his lawyer and not get any responses. Martinez's lawyer didn't provide any legal assistance with mitigating evidence, right? I mean, sure, Martinez already confessed to the crime. He's remorseful, right? The lawyer didn't bring up that he's remorseful, that he immediately confessed to it, that he just made one mistake while drunk and accidentally killed this guy. He was weeping as soon as he did it. He felt awful, dude. He didn't bring up the fact that Martinez didn't have a father figure in his life. He didn't bring up the fact that Martinez was abused and tortured and raped as a kid. Like, these are the things that could be used to make a jury think like, okay, this guy, he wasn't dealt a good hand. If someone's dealt a good hand and they still murder people, they're more likely to get executed than somebody who was just, you know, in terrible circumstances and made a mistake. His next lawyer, during habeas corpus, where you're supposed to point out in writing every single place where the past lawyer went wrong or where the court case was not done constitutionally, well, the new lawyer submitted a 6-page application. You may be thinking, that's good. You know, I wrote a 6-page paper back in high school. That was tough. It took me a few days. Yeah, well, the typical habeas corpus petition is well over 100 pages and reaches sometimes 200 or 300 pages, pointing out everywhere where the lawyer went wrong. And you would think that if a lawyer didn't talk to you at all, you would maybe submit more than 6 pages. After this, Martinez's lawyer withdrew from the case, and a new team of lawyers showed up to help pro bono, one of them being David R. Dow, a man who wrote this book. If you're interested in this kind of thing, read this book. It's very good, okay? Executed on a Technicality by David R. Dow. The new lawyers argued at hearing that Martinez did not receive competent legal support. The state then argued against the lawyers in the hearing, saying, look, I get what you're saying, but it doesn't make sense to have the resources expended for this case because you can't use anything legally speaking that wasn't in that habeas corpus petition, right? And that was just 6 pages long. So this is an issue where both sides are right, and it sucks because on the one side you have like, look, we're trying to save this guy's life. He's remorseful. He doesn't deserve death. Just give him life in prison, man. And then on the other side, you have the guy who's being like, we get that, okay? But you legally cannot present anything more than that was in those 6 pages. Now, Martinez's team is like, yeah, but that lawyer was incompetent, okay? We've got new lawyers. We're trying to point out that the lawyer who did the habeas corpus, who was trying to point out that the last lawyer was incompetent, he was incompetent, okay? Everyone here is incompetent. So they went to federal court, and the federal court decided Martinez deserved a competent attorney, but we're not required to find out if he's competent or not, right? But the issue is that this was backed by a historical case in Texas known as ex parte graves. The Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that the level of competency required by state and federal law only applied to qualifications at the time of the case appointment. Basically, since Martinez's lawyer had passed the bar exam 20 years ago, he was considered legally competent. First, Martinez's lawyer did a bad job and didn't prevent any mitigating evidence that could have turned one juror vote out of a 5-4 decision to execute him in order to save his life. They just needed one vote to be swapped. A second lawyer didn't say that the first lawyer did a bad job, and then the state court was like, we can't help you, but it doesn't make sense. And then the federal court was like, we're not required to help you. And so finally, right before he's executed, they're doing one last appeal, okay? They're like, we need a federal hearing. We want to ask the previous attorney some questions and some witnesses that weren't asked questions. The federal judge declared, and I quote, because Martinez had not presented this claim in a proper, timely manner in state habeas corpus, it was unexhausted and procedurally defaulted. Therefore, the federal court must simply ignore it and cannot decide it. That's right. Since everybody did a bad job, this guy's just dead. And imagine if he was actually innocent. Like, we know that this guy did the crime and he was remorseful about it, but if he was actually innocent, this happens to innocent people. This is why we can't reduce length of trials, right? To make them cheaper, because the current system already does a terrible job. And if we make it shorter, it'll just be worse. Because even with 20 years of appeals, it doesn't work out, right? You just get unlucky. You roll the dice wrong and you get bad lawyers and you're done, okay? And you may argue that regardless, he deserved it, right? Because he killed somebody. And if you murdered someone, you deserve to die. Eye for eye. You may still be under that belief system, which if you are, I respect it, okay? But the issue is that this is still happening in cases where somebody didn't commit the crime. For instance, the case of Max Sofar. Sofar was sentenced to death and left on death row to rot, despite his original conviction being overturned by the state. It was overturned because the only evidence supporting Sofar actually doing it was a thin case consisting only of an uncorroborated confession, which was a confession that was barely audible on a 2-hour-long tape recording of an interview. That interview, the interrogation, was 26 hours long over the course of 3 days. They only recorded 2 hours of it, and that 2 hours just happens to be the time that he confessed to it. Except he confessed to it while trying to accuse others of having committed the crime, not saying that he himself did it. Sofar, who sat on death row slowly dying of lung cancer, begged for clemency, seeing as he was almost universally considered innocent, right? The judge and jury who initially sentenced him were like, guys, he didn't do it. We got to get him off of death row. Well, the state of Texas responded that since Sofar didn't have an execution date scheduled, because they're like, we can't execute him because he's innocent, he doesn't have an execution date scheduled, so the state of Texas didn't have the authority to examine the case. Let me get this straight. This guy's on death row, right? He's just trapped there. He's not going to get executed. He's not going to get set free, right? He's just sitting on death row without an execution date because they discovered that he's innocent, and they can't free him because he doesn't have an execution date. Because this man is innocent, they can't let him off. Max Sofar would die after 30 years of being on death row with no execution date at the hands of lung cancer. Later, it was discovered that the man responsible for the murder that he supposedly committed, serial killer Paul Reed, a man who murdered a bunch of people. An innocent man was in prison for 30 years and then died on death row, which is terrible prison conditions because the government made a mistake and then either didn't have the means or didn't even try to find the means to set him free. They're making mistakes and they're not undoing them regardless of how this man's on death row for 30 years and we're paying death row prices for his imprisonment, which costs more than the general prison population, man. And we're paying it for a guy who's just innocent and sitting there, right? This is the state that our current execution system's in. I've seen a lot of stuff online where people are like, look, why don't we just bring it down to finding out if they're guilty and then giving them one appeal, right? But the issue is, we're already convicting the wrong people at least 13% of the time, right? That 13% that we previously studied was only the number of people who were actually freed. Max Sofar doesn't count in that 13%. Max Sofar is not one of the wrongly convicted people on that list because he didn't get freed. He didn't get exonerated. A man named Tommy Arthur sat on death row for 34 years because they made a decision and didn't undo it despite him being there for 34 years. He was executed. The only evidence pointing towards Tommy Arthur being the murderer was the victim of the murderer's wife, who said that she paid Tommy Arthur to kill the person. But initially, she didn't even point out Tommy Arthur as the murderer, right? We have a confession from a co-conspirator, right? That's what we think. But she didn't initially point out Tommy Arthur. Like, she was like, no, I don't know who that guy is. He didn't commit it. And you're like, oh, she's just covering for a boy. Then the courts were like, hey, if you point out Tommy Arthur specifically, you'll get parole for your life sentence. And she just immediately was like, oh yeah, it was Tommy Arthur. He definitely did it, dude. That was the only evidence. There was a wig found on the scene of the crime. They did a DNA test on it. They didn't find anything conclusive. 20 years later, they could do another DNA test, and they didn't bother, even though there's more evidence now, right? There was no evidence in that wig. The only evidence was someone who got something out of it. They were bribed into a confession. And Tommy Arthur died on death row, and he probably didn't do it. And he doesn't count in that statistic of 13% of innocent people sentenced to death. So online, people are like, give them one appeal. But the issue is they currently have 3 appeals, and we're still not freeing innocent people. Because the appeals are not the problem. The problem is that the system is fundamentally flawed. Not only is it flawed, it's skewed in a certain direction. We've already covered the economic issues, right? If you can afford a good lawyer, you're good to go, right? You're just going to get life in prison, if that. There's also the fact that the system is incredibly racist. In 80% of executed criminals' cases, the victim of their murder was white. And this has nothing to do with the murder rates, because in murder rates throughout the same period of time, 40% of murder victims were white. So that's a little bit suspicious, isn't it? Are you more likely to get executed if you kill a white person than a person of color? Yes. In fact, you are more likely to get executed if you are a black person killing a white person than if you're a white person killing a black person. How much? Well, there are 21 cases of a white man or woman killing a black person and getting executed for it. 14 times that many of cases have been a black person who killed a white victim. It is abundantly clear that judges and juries involve race in their decisions. And this is from statistics from the Death Penalty Information Center and the FBI, which is just the FBI, and they present our murder rates for us because they're kind like that. There's no standard for deciding who lives and dies. There's no like, if you kill 2 people, you get executed. No, it's subjective. And the issue is that biased people and biased officials will make biased decisions. The current death penalty system has put a value on human life. Some lives are worth more than others. So this is the current state of our death penalty system in America. It's too expensive and we can't reduce the length or the cost of it because we already make the wrong decisions far too often. We're convicting the wrong people and we're leaving innocent people just to die. This is why it is imperative that even the worst criminals don't get executed. If a Jeffrey Dahmer can be executed, then the possibility of you or your friend or your child being executed for something they didn't do is still there, right? It's still present. So in order to mitigate that risk, we gotta abolish the system because we're convicting the wrong people too often. We covered the financial aspect of capital punishment, showing how death row, legal review, and executions leech taxpayer dollars from the government's budget and cost far too much money. We unraveled the randomness and prejudice of the system and pointed out statistics that are like, hey, different lives are being valued at different prices. We also examined the morality of execution and the fact that it is very painful, and although murderers might deserve it, innocent people don't deserve to be tortured to death, and thus we should just, get rid of it, avoid that risk. Since 1977 in the United States of America, 200 people have escaped execution by the skin of their teeth, and we have no idea how many were not so lucky. This leads to the question of what is the average person supposed to do? Like, you can hardly be expected to change the law of a state, much less of a country. And you may already live in a state where the death penalty is abolished. First thing you can do is to keep capital punishment in mind when voting for local positions, right? Almost nobody knows who the district attorney is or what they stand for, but a DA who is very much for execution can and will lead to innocent people being executed. The second thing you can do is to spread awareness for this cause, which I'm not going to say, ooh, share this video, I want views. It's just like, let people know. Post articles on Facebook or Instagram, and other people can find out. Because no change can be made if no one knows about the issue. If we build up enough public pressure, the Supreme Court or President can commute sentences from execution to life in prison, which one of the most recent presidents did, right? He commuted a whole bunch of sentences to life in prison. And we have another president who's like, we're going to bring back executions in full force. And regardless on how you feel about either of the candidates, we can probably agree that bringing back executions in full force will just lead to more mistakes and more innocent people dying. Awareness leads to pressure, pressure leads to decisions, and those decisions can lead, one at a time, to dismantling the legal abomination that is capital punishment. Thanks for watching this if you did, and if you didn't, well then, no thank you. Please tell your siblings you love them, and above all, have yourself a tolerable day. Thank you.